Hey, greetings, everybody. Okay, let's continue with the Mark amp history. Well, all the history of the amplifier, as a matter of fact. That seems to have gotten a lot of views. I guess this has tapped into what you guys are interested in, so I'm happy to comply. Let me start with this. I'm going to show you a list of the amps in chronological order that I got from Steve Mueller, one of the Boogie partners and one of the most valuable guys that also was fired in the infinite wisdom. I can't explain that because he knew more about how to motivate and explain all the different models, how they work, and all that. He is just one of the Tone brothers. Couldn't have done it without him. He was one of the partners to whom I gave a substantial ownership of Mesa Boogie and covered the taxes too. And we'll talk about a bunch of these, but there's so many of them here that the quickest way, in my usual high tech here, is I'm just going to hold it up to the camera. You guys can pause it and look and see the amps that you own or talked about or were interested in owning. And then, in my usual inimitable fashion, I will wander down memory lane and try to be somewhat coherent, somewhat brief, and somewhat accurate. Okay, one of the things that Steve pointed out, he said, "Oh yeah, don't forget to talk about the Mark One reissue." Um, because that was a successful amp all by itself. But again, it brought out the shortcomings of the Mark One, which was you couldn't successfully preset a clean sound and then foot switch to a great lead sound. It just couldn't do that. So the solution was the Lone Star. Yes, the Lone Star was basically two Mark Ones in one amp. Um, and it was very successful. Still used today by Dominic Miller, Sting's lifelong guitar player, well, after the Police at any rate. And again, Steve Mueller, the deacon of Mesa Boogie, happened to be at a concert in, I think it was Colorado. He said, "Oh man, they were so kind." Dominic Miller just said, "Man, I wouldn't go on without my Lone Stars. Thank Randall, blah, blah, blah." Steve said the tone was godlike. It was just incredible. And of course, we're talking some of the top players and blah, blah. So that was all great. Okay, and then as you know, from the Mark One came the Mark Two, which did enable a player to preset the gain and the loudness independently twice, once for a clean sound and once for the new high gain sound. And then, generally speaking, as the evolution went from the Mark II, 3, 4, 5, and to the 7, a lot of that was dividing up the controls so that you had total flexibility without any compromise. Well, and again, that's what the Lone Star did, was it gave you two separate Mark I channels, only one of which had the extra high gain control knob on it. Sorry. And so it was a great amp, and it was in big demand by studio rental companies too. Um, so, and then another thing, again, I'm just going to be jumping around. One thing that I did mention was the original preamp that discovered and invented high gain had the high gain stage at the back end of the signal chain. And then, in order to get this to work properly, I put it at the front end of the signal chain in the Mark Ones, right? Well, when I was doing the Mark II design, that just didn't work. And so what I ended up doing was putting the overdrive stage in the middle of the signal chain. So first you got it at the tail end, then you got it at the front end, and then where it wound up is in the middle. And that's where it's been for all the Mark IIs. And everything that came from the Mark II, the 3, all Mark IIs, the Mark IIIs, and all his version, the 5, and so forth and so on. That was the way to be able to have the best control and the best sound. Another tidbit, I'm going to delve into some of the technical stuff. I mentioned the problem with the relay in the Mark IIAs and Bs, that the relay popped. If you were holding a note, didn't pop if you could pause a note, but that's pretty inconvenient. Then when I looked at the Fender infringement of my patent 4211893, it didn't pop. And inside were these clever little parts that I'd never heard of before, the light dependent resistors, the LDRs. So that became part of, I believe, um, the Mark III and the Mark IV, because what they do is they shift a resistance across this light dependent resistor rather than it's a hard switch going on and off. So then when we got to, the V Twins had those. And we shipped the pile of V Twins to Germany because it was a very successful preamp product. It was basically the preamp in a foot pedal. When they arrived, they didn't work. And we wanted to find out why and how. And so we got some of them back, and the LDRs were all faulty. So I phoned the application engineer, and I'm talking to him, and I said, so what? Tell me about what's happening. And he said, well, as you know, we moved our production to Puerto Rico because the labor was so much cheaper. And I said, okay, tell me about moisture. And oh, moisture is absolutely deadly. The slightest bit of moisture and it totally destroys that light dependent resistor part. And I said, oh, well, that would explain why everything that left here worked. And when it arrived in Germany, it didn't work. And he said, oh, yeah, I've been really having troubles with these girls here on this new, we're trying to save money. They have to put that epoxy in perfectly to prevent any moisture from getting in. And I keep hammering on them that they're not doing it right. So there you go. Huge problems, giant problems with these freaking LDRs. Now, also, the trouble with LDR, besides they're variable. They don't all go completely on. They don't all go completely off. They take time to do it, various amounts of time, and it's only one. So you got two wires, and the resistance is either very high or it'll get down as low as 100 ohms or so, which in most cases is virtually on. It's not 0 ohms like a wire, but it's on. So after these disasters, it's like, man, we got to go back to using relays because they're either on or they're off. But what about the pop? So I stressed on that, and I came up with this idea that I actually spawned from car ignition. And the big breakthrough when they went from magneto car ignition to what we've got now, which is a coil and a distributor with points. Here's how that works. And I thought about this and applied it, and it did work. What happens is when you when you charge anything that's like a magnetic coil, like a coil in a relay, for example, or the coil in an automobile's ignition system, then when you remove that DC voltage on that coil, the energy that was magnetic field collapses into a voltage pulse that comes out on the wires. You got that? Let me say that again. So you got two wires that go to a coil around some iron, right? And when you put electricity into them, you magnetize it, right? And now it's an electromagnet. Now, when you release that voltage and you just disconnect it, what happens is that energy that's in a magnetic field converts back into voltage, and there's a pulse. And I thought, man, that could be the key, because if I could get this pulse that's synced exactly when the relays are firing, I could use that to mute the pop, right? Brilliant. What a freaking great idea. And so I tried it out, and it was true. If you took an LDR and put it up to the relay, charged the relay, and then turned it off, the LDR go blink like that. And I thought, oh man, well, that will work with these LDRs. Well, it kind of did, and I used that in some amps, but it didn't go low enough. And again, it really wasn't the best way to do it. So what I came up with was, I got a better idea. I need to reverse the logic of it and use it to trigger an FET, a field effect transistor, which can instantly go to shorted and then open. Because as you guys know, who've dealt with the amps, there's always this real difficult part of dialing in an amplifier where you've got the trade-off of you're trying to mute the pop, which can be a pop, bang, thump. It can be all these different sources combined causing that noise when you switch, with how long is the sound not coming. And you players are very sensitive. You don't want to go, just a few milliseconds, less than half of a second, we start to hear some complaints. So we try to get that as fast as possible. At any rate, that was a patent. I forget the number. It's expired by now. And all you had to do was make sure that no matter how you switched, there was always a relay going off, and that would trigger this pulse bus that went to the transistor that inverted the logic that drove the FET. You got that? And the FET was the actual part. And the thing that was also cool about that is that you could separate that and have another one that had a long duration. Why would you want that? Well, I'll tell you, because when you're switching from a high gain sound and you're going instantly to a clean sound with the master way up and the reverb on, you hear the reverb decay from the distortion sound for the first half a second or more. When you go to the clean sound, you hear this, and everybody, what's that? That's worse than the pop. Well, that's the reverb. If you turn the reverb off, it's not there, but it's the tail end of the reverb signal decaying, which you're suddenly listening to really loud. So that was another virtue of this design. This idea was that you could have, with the same pulse bus, you could have an isolated FET that had a longer time constant on it. So it went on and then it gradually went off over a period. Again, we would adjust it for how long it took. It is around a half a second to 3/4 of a second or so. And some people notice that, very few. And they would say, hey, when I switch, and then suddenly I come on and then the reverb comes on, but it's not instant. There's like, that's right, it's not instant, because if it came on instant, you'd be hearing what the reverb was reverberating from the last sound, which was a high gain sound, completely different. And it just sounds like this huge trash noise on top of your otherwise pristine, clean sound. That's just an example of the kind of problems that have to be dealt with in order to create these amplifiers, make you guys happy, and eliminate all the things you couldn't find to complain about. Okay, so then again, part of it, and I'm sorry if I'm shouting, partly because some guy said, turn up your mic volume. Well, I can't find the mic volume on this thing. And when I played back the last one, it sounded loud enough to me. So if I'm shouting, sorry. I'll try to be mellow. At any rate, let's see. So many offshoots came from the Mark II architecture. And I want to give you a few because a lot of them were pretty groundbreaking. How about the rack revolution? How many of you guys remember when racks, big studio, well, not everybody, but lots of guys had big racks full of stuff? Well, one of the earlier products that I came up with was the M180 and the M190. Now, those were big monoblock power amplifiers, around 180 watts each, and a preamp for them. So the same thing was the quad preamp was basically 2 Mark II-C plus preamps in a 3-space rack. And that was really quite groundbreaking and popular. Now, it got to be pretty huge because you'd have the 3-space preamp, and then you'd have 2 4-space each monoblock power amps, and then guys would add all kinds of effects to it too. This was the era when studio, guys, and man, I'm telling you, you name it, Lukather, Dan Huff, this was the way that so many records were recorded in that era. And studio, Andy Brower, studio rental service or whatever it was a cartage service. A guy like Luke shows up, he wants his, at the studio, he wants his rig there. He's not going to go get a truck and haul it over there. So another whole area of evolution was shrinking this stuff. And by gosh, we sure did. I think the next step on the power amps was to put both of them in one, and that became the Stereo 400. And that had basically 2 M180s in the same package. And that was a pretty colossal package. So now instead of being 2 4-rack spaces, it was 1 4-rack space. And then my man Doug, who's always, oh man, can you shrink it more? It's like, oh, okay, so we got it down to 3 rack spaces. And that would have been the 395 and the switch track stereo 500. Those were really cool sheet metal, and they got it down to 3 rack space. Oh man, but couldn't you shrink it even more? So then that became the king of all of these, which was the 295, the stereo 290. Which truly was 2 rack spaces with 2 simulclass 4-tube each, so it had 8 6L6s in a little 2-rack space. So you can see where we're going with this. And then, of course, there was the 50-50 and the 20-20 because a lot of people didn't need that much power. And meanwhile, this is what I like to do. I like to design cool-ass electronic musical products. And if you paused my blathering and looked at that list of all of those amps that I just held up, you'll see there is, God, I don't know, I didn't even count them up, but there's a lot of them there. And I like doing that. And, yeah, they all had a purpose. And they all, like I just said, they all started from something and then tried to make it better and better and better. Okay, so where do I want to go from this? Man, I'm just jumping all over the place. So, oh yeah. So one of the things was, the quad preamp. Okay, lots of guys use that. So then, let's make a smaller one. That was the studio pre, the Stud pre as we called it. And that was one Mark II-C channel. And one of the most famous practitioners of that was Kurt Cobain. So all of his gain sounds and all of the famous Nirvana stuff, that was a Stud pre, a studio preamp played through a Crown power amp, hello Lee Michaels, into a Marshall 412. So on stage it looked like, oh yeah, he's playing a Marshall. Well, no, it was a hybrid rig of our Stud pre, which is really where the tone came from. Crown DC 300 where the loud power came from, and a Marshall 412 because why not? Everybody's got them. And great sounds, as you all know. Terrible joke. Sound to die for, huh? Ooh, sorry, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. Okay, so meanwhile, one of Doug's friends and one of our perpetual friends, a cat named Dan Van Riesen, and he comes up with the idea for the Triaxis preamp, right? And that's 1 rack space, fully analog. All of our Mark Series preamp circuits with 512AX7s, and the whole thing is controlled by this massive amount of LDRs. This was before they moved offshore to save money, which bankrupted them and caused us to change everything. So that Triaxis, that was a long living product. And the Tri-290 rig, you guys that have them and you guys that have heard them, that was the king of kings in the rack world. And again, that was only 3 rack spaces. So it's stereo programmable, all tube analog preamp, faithfully including all of our Mark IIA, Mark I, Mark IIB, Mark IIC, all of that. And finally, the latest version actually had a rectifier preamp, and I remember when we added another board that dropped down, and we were talking about dropping an engine, a big engine in a small car, and that was what we went to some race car garage and took a picture of that happening, this big V8 dropping into. So we were having fun with that, but that's what that really was. So here's how that worked, and I wrote the patent for it. I just wrote the patent. Dan came up with the idea and how to do it. There is certain kind of these LDRs that have 3 wires. There's one in the middle, and what he did was he used the LDRs in a kind of a feedback control loop so that they knew what to go to. One half did the audio, and the other half measured it against a fixed resistor, and it would adjust itself instantly to the fixed resistor value, if you're following me. So, and then all of this could be stored in, I believe, 128 different programs. And again, a whole lot of them, we had presets. So you go to this and it's a preset of Mark 1. Then you go to this, a preset of Mark 1 with a fat pulled. You go to this, it's a Mark 2. There's several of the Mark 2s and so on and so forth. Again, a groundbreaking product, really, and one that people still, I still see them occasionally that come back for service, and guys say, man, that is my rig. I can't get along without it. I'm never going to get rid of it. So, again, thanks, Dan. Triaxis, man, a wonderful, groundbreaking product, ahead of its time. And again, like we always do, if you looked at these lists, you see that most of these amps lasted 10 years, maybe some a little less, some a whole lot more. And then they were usually replaced by one that was the same but better. Let me see if I have any other ideas that I want to get out here on this. I'm sorry I'm jumping all around. So yeah, when we get up to the Mark IVs, now that, again, as I mentioned, was kind of a transition in terms of trying to get separate tone controls for each of the two modes. And it kind of did it. Like I said, at least had it. But what I wanted to talk about that I didn't mention last time was it had a fatter, fuller sound, kind of, that guys still prefer. And it's why we have that circuit in the Mark V and in the Mark VII, because it is fatter, fuller, and thicker. And you got guys like Mike Morton of Lamb of God. Yeah, he loves all the other shit. But he said, no, that Mark IV sound, that's me. Chevelle, same thing. Seven Dust, same thing, is that fatter, fuller, thicker lead sound that is the Mark IV. Fatter, fuller, and thicker than the 2C, which, of course, as you know, is pretty king time right now. Now, one more thing about the 2C Plus reissue, which I told you was my last project before I got summarily fired. Don't ask me why. I guess I was the messenger, and we don't want to discuss the problem. We want to get rid of the messenger. Well, life is full of problems, and as I mentioned, you can't use the LDRs anymore. You got to go to a relay. The relay pops. You got to figure out how to solve the relay pop. So that's where the 2C Plus reissue deviates from the original. The original had LDRs. We are not going to use LDRs. I don't even know if they're still available. I don't think so. I think that company went bankrupt. They had to actually pay us because all of those V-twins, and there were hundreds of them, were bad as a result of them, again, the corporate. We know better. We're going to save money. And right, how did that work out? It's the same old story, folks. It doesn't work out, because when you got something right, don't mess it up trying to save a buck, because you're going to end up losing way more than the buck you planned on saving. And that's just from hard-earned experience. So what does the 2C Plus have? Well, it's got relays instead of the LDRs. And of course, it has to have the relay mute circuit. Otherwise, it would have this huge bang, which guys say, well, how come it pops? Because the 2C didn't pop. Well, because the 2C used LDRs and we can't use those anymore. It's my life. These are the kind of problems that keep you awake at night. And then when you solve them, eventually it's like, oh, whew, what a relief. Oh, geez, man, let's have a drink. Let's toast one. And thank goodness we solved that, and now things are better. And you guys don't need to know about that, because it's our job. It's like my dad told me when I was playing clarinet as a little kid. He said, no, you just got to sound good. If the reed sucks, they don't want to know that, oh, my reed is no good. They just want to hear you play. Don't give them any excuses. So it's the same. How come this pops? Well, because we don't know what we're doing yet. But we had to look at Fender to find out this part that we didn't know existed. But then they didn't work anymore because the company tried to save money by offshoring it. Yeah, come on. And they weren't cheap either. They were over $1 each. And So when you ended up with 20 or so, I think the Mark IV had 24 of them in there. You know, well, how come a Boogie costs so much? Well, just those alone is $25 or more just for those. All right, so ramble on here. I'm sorry if this is disorganized, but I can't help it, man. That's the way life is. I don't got a crystal ball, and I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow. I don't even know what I'm doing tonight, much less what I'm just talking to you about. But I will say this. I think I touched the nerve that you guys have been waiting to hear about more amp history because what, 11,000 plus views already on the previous one and 400 comments. Again, thank you. Thank you guys for the comments. I really appreciate them. I do try to answer all of them because you guys are worth it. I mean, you made my life. I'm here to serve you. And to me, it's always been an honor. You guys come first. And with that, I will say thanks again, sayonara, and that's part 2. Maybe we'll do a part 3 because there's so many more amps on that list, and there's stories behind all of them. Okay? Thanks for watching. Catch you later. See ya.